Hiring the wrong executive costs you time and money. Leveraging work psychology, Spirit Consulting helps you hire the right executive so you can focus on growing your business. For a free quote, visit spiritmco.com. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Tips for Team Building podcast, where our mission is to inspire and propel others along in their leadership journeys. So excited to welcome today's guest, Dr. Robert Kolts. Rob, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. For those who don't know you, really like to start with a softball first. So who are you?
Yeah, thanks, Jaden. Just want to say, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. Really excited to be here. So my name is Rob Kolts. I'm the clinical director at Overjet. For those who aren't familiar with Overjet, we're a tech startup and the largest provider of artificial intelligence services for dental x-rays in the United States. So that's what I do. But to your question of who am I, I think what I'm most proud of is my personal titles, and that's that of father and husband. I've been married to my best friend for 17 years, and we have 7 children. Yes, you heard that correctly, 7 children. My oldest is 15, my youngest is 1, and they promised me that they would not barge in while we're doing this. So, but yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Jane.
Wow. How do you find time? You've got a really busy professional job, and then, obviously the commitment to your relationship for 17 years and 7 children. When do you sleep, Rob?
There's a couple hours that I get a night at least. No, I'm very fortunate. My wife stays home with the kids. She works way harder than I do. I love what I do professionally. I love, being a dad and being with the kids. So there's a good balance, and she's kind of the boss, taking care of things here with the kids, and allows me to have a lot of success professionally. But it's an ebb and flow, and that there's times where it's harder, and you got to balance work with everybody has this, right? You got to balance work with recitals and sports events and things, and so same challenges everybody else has, just maybe magnified by a couple of kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you kind of talked to that professional success that you've been able to have, Rob. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you've gotten into the leadership position you're in today?
Sure, absolutely. So I graduated dental school about a decade ago, so 2012, and I have not had your stereotypical dentist career for the last 10 years. I was probably 3 months into private practice after graduating dental school, where I came home to my wife and really questioned if I had made the right decision, if I had wasted my time in dental school. I just I was good at dentistry. I was making good relationships with the patients, but I just found I wasn't passionate about the clinical practice that I was doing. And so I thought long and hard, should I go on and specialize? Should I do something else? And my wife kind of looked at me and she said, look, I just spent 4 years in dental school with you. You're going to go make some money while you figure this out. Okay. So I ended up going and getting an MBA from Penn State. It was an executive program, so nights, weekends, online. And then after that program was done, I joined up with my best friend from dental school. Actually, we moved out to Portland, and over a couple of years bought a handful of dental practices. Grew that, and then ended up selling that. We had some personal concerns, so we ended up having to relocate to be closer to family out in Utah. So for a year, I actually commuted back from Utah to Portland, Oregon to help manage these practices and hold team meetings and things. But anyone who's traveled a significant amount knows that sort of schedule is it's not necessarily a long-term solution. So I ended up selling that group. And eventually found my way back here to Pennsylvania, where I had first practiced out of dental school. Just a couple of miles from where I lived, was recruited to be a chief operating officer for a small dental support organization here. And, I had a lot of good experiences helping run that organization. I was here for just a couple of years before I was introduced to Overjet, who's my current employer. And, so transitioning from clinical practice to, and I've always maintained a part-time clinical practice for all these years, but to more of an executive operations leader, to now a clinical leader at a tech startup. It's been quite a journey, but with my current position, I have a lot of opportunities to interact with a lot of dental organizations and really help them implement and go through this change management process as they roll out, a new technology solution. So it's been really eye-opening for me because I got to see a lot of things that organizations are doing well, and I get to see some things that organizations maybe could improve upon, and I get direct comparisons because I interact directly with the executives of a lot of these organizations. So it's been an interesting career ride so far, but I've had a blast while I've been doing it. I feel like I've grown personally, professionally along the way. And, I feel very fortunate to have the position I'm at. I think there's a lot of dentists who would love to have the position I'm at with Overjet.
Yeah, and I think just thinking to your reflection, your reflection point 3 months in, is so important because I think that so many times you see people, especially folks who have put in like a lot of work, spend a lot of money to like go, a certain path, go get a certain degree, etc., that they're like, oh, now I'm stuck here, right? And just being able to recognize like, is this where I'm getting fulfillment? Maybe not, but how could I use this skill set, this knowledge, etc., to find a position where I'm getting fulfillment? So I think just kudos to you for taking that leap of faith because I'm not sure that many people would.
Well, I think anybody who's in the dentistry profession, and this is probably true for a lot of professions, is there's a lot of Facebook groups out there, and there's constantly posts of people saying, I'm 10 years in, I'm burnt out, I don't want to do this anymore. Or there's posts of, hey, what jobs can I get as a dentist that don't involve seeing patients? And so I think anybody who's in dentistry, and I think this is true in a lot of other professions as well. For example, I'm part of a number of different Facebook groups, and in these groups, you will see a significant number of posts of people who are saying, hey, I've been here practicing dentistry for 10 years. I'm burnt out. What else can I do? How can I use my dental license and not have to see patients? And that wasn't necessarily the case with me. I actually quite enjoy the clinical practice of dentistry. It just was something I recognized early that I didn't think was going to be a long-term fit for me to do 5 days a week for the next 40 years of my career. So, I've been fortunate that I've been able to practice clinically throughout my career, at least, a day a week or a couple days a month, but be able to use some skills that I feel like I had that I wanted to utilize that I didn't feel like was necessarily being utilized chairside with patients.
Yeah. And so I think that that's great to just have that moment of truth to figure that out. So Rob, you talked about some of the other skills that you want to you wanted to leverage outside of just the clinical skills that you have. So thinking business, thinking leadership, etc., which is where you find yourself now. And I think one of the most important skills that a leader can have is their skill and their ability to be able to build relationships. So would love to hear more about your philosophy, your approach to building relationships as a leader.
There's a fine line when you're a leader, right? You want to be engaged with your team members, and your employees, and your coworkers. You want to open up to a degree, but on the other hand, you still, at the end of the day, need to be a leader, and you need to be able to make a tough decision. And sometimes it can be hard to make a decision if you feel like there's friendship and emotions and things on the line. So I think that as a leader, you have to be aware that if you're not engaged at some sort of personal level with your team members, that you're not going to get the maximum output from them. And I hate saying output because it sounds like a factory, but I think we all recognize we're talking emotional output and physical output, and having them be the most engaged that they can be. And so I think you have to engage with them to a degree at a personal level. They have to know that, hey, I've got 7 kids, right? I go through the same challenges and struggles on a personal basis that you're going through. I recognize the challenges that you have. And then the other part of that is you have to be able to get to know your team members. So you need to be able to have an understanding of things that they're going through. And I think that helps you see them more than just, a factory worker that has output, but as a person that has a backstory to them. And so being able to engage with them on a personal level, I think gives them a more fulfilling work experience. I think we get better performance from them overall. And then I think as a leader, we come off as a more human leader rather than as somebody who's just there trying to get them to meet a goal or a deadline or a KPI or something.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I think it's so important, one analogy that I've probably shared on the podcast we've released to this point, over 10 episodes, and I've probably shared it at least 10 times. It's like this analogy that like, realistically, a lot of leaders, especially like old style leaders, and I don't want to say older style leaders, maybe it's just a different style and approach to leadership, is like putting up the Great Wall of China between like the personal and professional, and you leave it all at the door, you don't bring anything in, whatever. And I think, in my personal philosophy and approach, I just don't think that's realistic. I think that, you know, realistically, it's probably more like a chain link fence in the way that you want to have some sort of barrier, right? Like you don't want everything overflowing, but that when things get tough, there's a breeze between the two, and things can pass through between the two. Um, and I think that it's just so important to recognize that, because, like you said, if someone is dealing with personal struggles, that may affect the professional. So the performance management conversation that you have might be a different one, right? It might be just to be kind of that ear to listen, and to be able to help them, potentially through their personal struggles as well. And I think that that's just such an important piece of advice that I like to highlight, is just recognizing that you can't separate the two. And if you think that you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. So learning how to navigate between the two is probably more realistic.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think if I always try to be the leader that I would want to have, right? And so if I, let's say my wife had to go out of town and I'm working from home and I have a sick child, right? Like there's a certain change to the output that I'm able to give that particular day, right? Because there's some other duties that are splitting my focus, and even though I'm trying to give everything I can to work, the reality is I do have another priority that's competing. And when you have a manager that you have a relationship with, that you can share that with, and they can give you a measure, a level of understanding. Yes, there's deadlines and things that need to get done, but certainly we understand this is going on. I think it makes the work environment a place where you're not going to have employees feeling like they need to leave every time another offer comes around, right? Because they're going to recognize that, hey, I have relationships here, I have some friendships with my coworkers, and I have the ability to have a manager who's understanding when I'm having a tough circumstance. And I think that's really important for long-term retention for employees.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you kind of spoke a little bit to, what I would define then as culture and that work environment, and just creating that, so that way that increases engagement, increases retention, etc. Um, and sometimes culture is a tricky animal to figure out. It's tricky when you've been in an organization for a long time and you're trying to like impact change on the culture, but it's also tricky as a new leader potentially coming into a new organization, into a new culture. And I think right now you're seeing so many, the employee side of the market is very hot. A lot of people are making changes, taking on promotional opportunities, joining new organizations, etc. So I think this next question's, really, relevant in that way. So Rob, you mentioned that you had just recently, within the last year, joined Overjet. And you had also mentioned, coming in as the COO, or being hired as a COO at the smaller DSO. And would love to hear more about how you adapt to a culture when you're entering a new position. How much is it you adapting? How much is it trying to enforce adaptation on the other side? Would love to just hear about a time where you had to adapt to a new culture and how you were able to do so.
Yeah, I've really had that experience, like you mentioned, twice over the last few years. And I think it comes down to, we all have our sort of base core values that we hold, our personal beliefs and values, integrity and honesty and ethics and morality and things like that. And so, hopefully we all have this core set of ethics that we come in with that we're really not willing to change, right? Like I have some integrity and honesty. I'm not willing to give these pieces up. But then there's an aspect of culture that's more influenced by kind of our surroundings and what's happening around us, and how other team members and people on our team, what their expectations are. And so, as I came into the chief operating officer role here in Pennsylvania, um, this was an organization that was led by dentists, a lot of partners in the organization. So there's about a dozen different partners in the group, and every one of them had their own expectations, and every one of them kind of ran their practice a little bit differently. And so the culture within each individual practice, had a little bit of a different feel from practice to practice. And so as I was trying to get to know these individuals that I'd be working with and serving as their COO, there was a challenge to recognize what their expectations were of me. And so, coming in and, is this a you clock in at 7 a.m. and you don't leave till 6 p.m. sort of organization, or is this a come and go and get your stuff done and we're not going to monitor your time sort of organization? So, all those details that we all work through with a new position. And then Overjet was a completely, different experience. And it was really unique for me because it was my first time entering sort of a tech startup, private equity backed type of setting where it's fast pace. When they say we want this done fast, they're talking hours, not days or weeks. Which is different. There's some DSOs where fast for a DSO might be, hey, we're going to implement this within the next quarter or 2 quarters. And so recognizing that, the availability of hours and when expectations and deadlines were due. But, I go back to what I said when I first started this is I still had my core values, right? Like my family was first, right? My faith was number 2. And then I assimilate myself into the organization the best I can. And really the best way to do that is to understand what your expectations are, make sure you've got a good onboarding plan, because really that sets the tone for the culture and you can see what the expectations are. And then I think most people will pick up pretty quickly from talking with other employees. If the feedback that you've been given during the interview process matches up with what the actual expectations are once you start a job, because I think we all recognize there's an element of sales in recruiting. But as long as you're founded and you have your core set of culture, I find I can assimilate pretty well.
Were there, when thinking to maybe this most recent transition to Overjet, were there any specific challenges that you faced in kind of making that assimilation or, making that transition?
I think for me, the main challenge was really just as I came into an organization. So I was I think I was about like employee number 41. Okay. Well, 9 months later, we've got like 150 employees. So we're seeing a significant amount of growth. And I came in there as really the second component to this. We have a couple of products at Overjet, one that serves insurance and one that serves the practice. So I kind of split roles with this other doctor that had been there, and he went and focused more on the insurance, and I split the practice because we were growing so fast. It was, no longer a one person role. So it was really a new role that we were making up for me as we went. Now, I was fortunate I had a good 90-day rollout plan. But, at one point, the HR person reached out to me and said, hey, can you write a job description for what you do and send it to me so we can have it on file, right? And this is like the nature of a startup when you're moving faster than like the organization has been able to keep up. And I think this happens across that sort of environment. It's not unique to where I'm at, certainly. But it really, that was the challenge, is making sure the expectations for what they wanted for my output match what I was expecting to give for my input. And so as long as those align, I think you end up having expectations that are met. And it's when those aren't communicated clearly, right? If I'm expecting to give a certain level of input and they're expecting something different on their end, that's when you have new hires that end up struggling to onboard at a rapid pace, or they never get on board and they end up fizzling out of the company. It's all down to expectations.
Yeah. So when thinking about, Rob, kind of the very fast-paced environment that you're in now, you mentioned that sometimes the company moves faster, like it's just like moving so quickly, and that may, just have you like in many different directions in terms of your priorities. I guess when thinking through like change management or just like prioritization, how do you balance, new initiatives, which I'm sure that you have plenty, versus making improvements to what's already there? Because if you are moving that fast, I'm imagining nothing was done perfectly, and, and perfect is kind of like impossible. But I guess how do you balance like rolling out the new stuff versus trying to improve what's already existing?
Yeah, so I think we can look at that from a couple of angles. So in my role as clinical director, really my primary function is to work as a change management agent for these organizations, whether they're individual dental practices or larger dental groups that are looking at implementing Overjet software. And so, really I go through the change management stages, right? You have to recognize, get the employees to be aware that the change is going to happen. You have to have them have a desire to make the change. You have to have them get the right knowledge to be able to complete whatever the new change is going to be. And then they have to have the ability to actually make that change become effective. And then you have to continually retrain and reinforce that piece. So if you go through those change management stages, what I find is that the success of the implementation, can be very high. But if you skip any one of those steps, then what ends up happening is that the rollout is either significantly delayed, or the ROI that you're hoping to achieve by rolling it out takes a much longer time to achieve. And so I've seen a rollout go really well where all those steps were followed almost to the T. We gave recommendations, they followed out, and there was a lot of reinforcement. And then I've been in organizations where I walked in to help do a training, and the people looked at me and said, "What's Overjet?" And so, we've skipped some pieces in that change management phase at that point. And so it makes the rollout much bumpier and more challenging. And to your question on an internal aspect, because we're such a young company, we're growing so fast. That is a challenge that we have, is how do we balance perfecting what we have and releasing a new feature, for example. And really, it comes down to, are we gathering the adequate feedback from all the stakeholders, right? From the customers, from the product team, from those who are in front of the product all the time. And yes, we do release a lot of MVP, some minimal viable product, but with the goal of always coming back and reiterating and perfecting those over time. And so that's just a constant balance, and it comes down to, I think, prioritization. And do you know what your priorities as an organization are? Do you know where your biggest area of need is and where your biggest area of success is? And if you measure the ROI, do you get a bigger ROI from tweaking your success or from tweaking your failure? And so being able to measure those, I think, can be very impactful. And then that'll give you a direction as far as where you should focus the next iteration and where your change management process should really focus.
Have you been feeling unfulfilled? You want to be happy, but just continue to struggle. One of the best ways to experience joy is by caring for the homeless. A charity I've grown to love, River of Light, food rescues 1 million meals per year for the needy in Chicago. Imagine how that makes you feel, knowing that you're helping feed children and veterans. To make a tax-deductible donation, visit riveroflightchicago.org. Again, riveroflightchicago.org. No one should go to bed hungry.
Yeah. So when thinking about, that, Robin, you kind of talked about the, the example of the group who said, who are you? What do you do? Right. And, obviously that's a bit extreme. But I think that, right now, especially in kind of the healthcare space, in different areas that are reacting. I think the whole economy is reacting from the pandemic and is still catching up from things, specifically healthcare, retail, some of the areas that were, hit harder. And with that, organizations, leaders, they're trying to, roll things out to be ready for the next thing that might happen, or to help the company rebound, or maybe take a new direction. And so I think, change management, as you kind of, just spoke to how important it is. I think it's such an important skill to kind of highlight. I guess when you do have those team members who are reluctant to change, and that could be, in the role you're in now, or maybe, just, individuals within your team, in prior roles or whatever it may be, new doctors, old partner doctors, whatever it may be. How do you deal with team members who are reluctant to change? And what's kind of your approach or philosophy around that?
Yeah, so I feel like that's really what my career has been for the last 8 years while I've been doing operations is working with clinicians specifically on this change management process, right? So clinicians can tend to be a little resistant to new changes. You get in a routine, you feel like it's working, and nobody really wants to come and say, "Hey, change this to get a 5% improvement on patient outcomes or revenue or whatever it is you're trying to measure. But it's really those first two steps of the change management. It's the awareness and the desire that you really have to focus on in order for this to be successful. So you have to make the employees, your team members, recognize why the change that you're trying to implement is important. And if you can get them to recognize why it's important, and it has to be important, right, for a reason that they agree is important. If the reason it's important is because it's going to make the company another dollar, your employees may not agree that that's an important reason, right? Now that is a reason, and probably always a reason, or many times a reason when you're doing these changes. But there has to be a reason that the employee recognizes. So what is important to the employee for their specific job function? If you're talking about dentists and hygienists, right, they truly care about their patients. They want better patient outcomes. So when we're talking about artificial intelligence, I don't always lead with the fact that I know the practice will generate more revenue by using artificial intelligence. I know because we measure it, because that's a terrible lead, and they don't agree that that's a good reason. But when I tell them that they're going to get increased patient case acceptance, they recognize that as a benefit because they see that, hey, I'm already diagnosing this work as a clinician, and now I can use this platform to have the patient increase their willingness to accept that treatment. And so they recognize the benefit. So if you go through those processes, I think that's where you get the best awareness. And that can be through individual one-on-one meetings. That can be through group lectures. Where I've done this, where I've gone and presented an hour and a half long lecture to a group of 100 doctors and talked to them about artificial intelligence and the benefits. And when you walk away from those meetings, you get the doctors who come up to their operation teams and say, hey, how do I get this in my office? Right. And that's what you're looking for when you're doing this change management, rather than sending them an email saying, hey, we're rolling out Overjet in your office. The trainers will be there Tuesday. Like, there's a very big difference between how those are rolled out. Now, I use Overjet as the example because that's where I'm at, but this is true for any initiative that you're trying to roll out in your organization, whether it's a new metrics dashboard or it's a new clinical product you want to roll out, whatever it is in your organization. Awareness and desire. That's the first two. You cannot skip those two steps.
Yeah, and I think it's a point that you highlighted is the why for each team member or each group of team members, right? Because different groups are going to have different priorities, and it's so like you see so many times where it's like, oh yeah, the why, because we're going to make more money, the CEO is going to be loaded, like it's great, and like team members are like, yeah, I don't care. Like, what does this mean? Like, what's in it for me? Which I think is, what team members are always looking for. So being able to shift your message or your tone or your approach based on the audience that you have, I think is such an important skill set when thinking of change management, because if you're using the same message for all stakeholders, that message may only resonate with a certain, percentage of those stakeholders.
And I think that's where the role of the leader comes in, right? The leader has to be able to recognize that you can't read from a script every time. You have to know some high-level bullet points, and you have to adapt to the needs of your audience. And that's where leadership comes in.
Yeah. So when thinking about leadership and thinking about conversations and adapting to audiences and kind of growing and such, I want to kind of shift into a little bit of performance and personnel management, and would love to hear, Rob. I think that it's so easy to see executives who are highly accomplished and have done so many great things, who have been presidents and COOs of dental support organizations, clinical directors, MBA, DDS, and be like, man, Rob never made a mistake. Like, this guy is just rock solid. I'm sure that he approaches everything perfectly. He's never misstepped or been able to do that. Like, it's so easy as like an audience member who maybe hasn't had the same level of success to kind of like place our guests on kind of a pedestal of like having never misstepped. And so would love to hear about maybe a time, I think that I would say in leadership, I know one of the biggest challenges that I had was going from like having the cordial relationship building, like fun fun leadership times to like the performance management conversations that we all kind of dread. And that was a huge challenge of mine, and definitely, learned along the way how to handle those, and learned from missteps, etc. Could you maybe share with a time where you misstepped a performance management conversation, kind of what happened and what you were able to learn from it to kind of guide how you have those conversations today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a very good learning experience early on in my career. So I got my MBA, I'd moved to Portland. I had bought my very first dental practice with my business partner, and we were rookies, right? Here, I was a DDS MBA, so I felt like I knew a lot. And then it takes real world experience to teach you that you actually don't know as much as you think you do. And so we hired some front desk staff for this office that we had just acquired. And I had checked the references on this one individual, and the reference came back. This is my first time ever checking references, right? I've never hired a single person before. And the reference came back, and they, I was talking to them on the phone. They said, "Oh, the work that they do is great, but they've had she had a lot of unfortunate personal experiences. So unfortunately, she wasn't here very much." And so, I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but I'm like, okay, well, it sounds like when she's there, she's great. So, I mean, those personal circumstances are probably gone. So we'll go ahead and, hired her. And she was with us probably 10 months and ended up calling out for over 30 business days during that 10 months. And it was always like, hey, my kid's really sick, or I broke my foot, or my grandmother died. Like any individual thing would be like, oh my goodness, that's so tragic. Yes, take whatever time you need. But it was like every other week there was another thing, and she'd miss 3, 4, 5 days of work. And, it got to the point where I was so desperate, though, just to have a person sitting in the chair at the front desk, that I just kind of let this continue on. And it got to the point where it was impacting the morale of the other employees. Like they were recognizing that there's an individual who was not holding up their end. It was actually causing more work for the other team members. They were having to pick up all these things that she would drop when she'd call in sick or whatever it was last minute. And so finally it took 10 months of this before I had, a serious conversation with her. And we determined that, look, it doesn't look like you're going to be able to meet the needs of this job. And she agreed that things weren't going to change. And so we ended up separating ways. But the morale from the other employees didn't bounce back immediately. It took a number of months to really gain back their trust. And even though we were short-staffed up there, they all felt like a burden was lifted, because at least they knew what was expected of them every day. They didn't know if they were going to have help there or not. And eventually we hired some other employees, and everything turned out great. But since then, I've started doing a couple of things. I've really tried to start addressing issues more in the moment, right? So there's an appropriate time to address it, and there's times that aren't. But as soon as it's appropriate to address it, I like to address it in the moment. I don't like to dress down individuals in front of fellow employees or things like that. But if I can pull them aside and have a private conversation, I feel like that's more impactful, because you're close to the proximity of whatever the need for the conversation. Whereas if you're waiting for a quarterly or an annual review and you're going to say, oh yeah, there was this one time where you did this, it's hard for them to really make meaningful behavior changes. So that's been the big one. And then the other one is I've tried to give employees the benefit of the doubt. And once I hire you, I want you to be successful. And I'm going to do everything I can and give you every resource that I have available to me to help you be successful. But if it becomes apparent that it's not going to fit and we can't give you the resources you need to be successful, then it's best for that employee, and it's certainly best for the organization to separate ways and find a better fit for that employee, and then find a better fit employee for your organization. So those are really the two takeaways I took from that experience. And it took some trauma and some headache. Almost lost a couple of other employees by not learning that lesson fast enough. But I attribute my success today to equally as much of my failures as I do my successes that I've had. And I certainly wouldn't have had the lessons learned any other way. I think we learn things for a specific reason. And if you ask my wife, she'll have a list of mistakes I've made if you want more. So
I do love, Rob, kind of, I think still want to give kudos for obviously, taking a little bit of time to recognize, the need to address things immediately and kind of coach in the moment. But I think that, I saw a meme a couple weeks ago on LinkedIn where it was like, I have this terrible, this manager's going to HR and they're like, I have this terrible employee. They've done X, Y, and Z. They're not, fitting. Can you help me? And, the HR person just responds like, have you had a conversation with them? And the manager's like, no. So I think that like there are many leaders who struggle, even after many years to have those conversations. But I think that's really what differentiates, between the manager and the leader, is that you're leading with your heart and leading to help, like, because, ultimately I think those difficult conversations, if they're coming from a good place, the employee can tell that. Oftentimes the employees know if they're not meeting expectations and like, so that kind of differentiates you as someone who wants to like support them in moving past these issues. If that's doable, and sometimes it may not be, but I think you don't know if you avoid having that conversation.
Well, I think that goes back to what you talked about earlier, and that's if you don't have some level of a personal connection or relationship with your team members, if the only time you come to talk to them is to tell them what they're doing wrong, like you're not going to have a high performing team, right? And again, I don't believe that you should be best friends with people reporting to you necessarily, but you do need to have some sort of level of relationship. And what I found is that people don't often quit the job, they quit their manager. Right. And so if they have a good manager who tries to help them be successful, they will put up with a lot of job nonsense around them. But as soon as they have a manager who's not supportive of them, who's not helping them be successful, and they feel like they don't have an advocate on their team, that's when they start looking for other jobs elsewhere. At the dental group that I helped run, we released a series of 12 questions. And every one of the 12 questions, and I didn't make them up. I got them from a book on what the world's best managers do or something like that. It's a list of questions that only one of them ever mentions the word supervisor, but all 12 of them can be impacted by the supervisor. So really, it's a survey on how well is your manager supporting you. And it was really an eye-opening survey because we found there was one specific practice that got significantly lower scores than all the others, and surprised they were having high turnover. And so, by using that survey, we're able to pinpoint the breakdown from the managerial standpoint and able to help address that. And so if you have a strong manager, I think you have strong teams. And when you have strong teams, that's when you have a successful company.
Love it. Love it. So thinking, Rob, obviously as a leader, you have that responsibility to coach and develop your own team, your direct reports. And, if you're at the level where your direct reports have direct reports, then your indirect reports, and kind of setting that example and helping them grow. But I'm sure that in your role, especially right now in a fast growing startup, it sounds like you all are kind of like learning on the fly and kind of like piecing, that sounds bad, right? But I think, there probably are certain elements where just the nature of the beast in tech and startup, in a fast paced environment, is that there is a nature of learning on the fly and such. And I think that opens up an opportunity for you as a leader to not only like coach downwards when thinking of like the org chart, but to also like coach upwards, and holding others accountable, just sharing feedback, whatever it may be. Can you share your approach to coaching up or coaching sideways within an organization? Because I think that's something that a lot of folks probably struggle with.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the aspects of my jobs that I've really enjoyed over time, is being able to help others grow individually. So at Overjet, to your point, I often say that it feels like we're building the ship as we're flying it. So that was accurate, and that doesn't mean the ship's not great. It just means that we're kind of discovering things as we go. But there are a lot of opportunities within any organization, I think, for you to make an impact, even if you don't have a direct report. There's a good book I read a year or two ago called Leading Without Authority. And the whole premise of the book is, how do you demonstrate leadership if you don't have a direct report? Like, how can you influence those around you positively that you don't have a reporting relationship with? And you can still be a leader and act like as a leader would in a situation where you might not have people reporting to you. And the way you do that is through example. It's through getting your work done. It's through being available. If others have questions, they can feel they can come to you, even if there's no reporting relationship. And then I think as a leader, your success as a leader should be measured by the success of those reporting to you and the organization as a whole. And so how do you build those individuals up? How do you help them recognize areas where maybe they have some inadequacies or deficiencies in a certain area? How do you help augment those so that they can learn and grow in those areas? And so being able to recognize that within your team members and then be able to help give them the particular information they need. So, one of my favorite exercises I like to do with direct reports is discover together maybe some area where they feel like they need help with, and then picking a book, for example, and then reading it, not together, but reading it individually in sections and then coming together and discussing and having, discussions and how can we apply this into our current, work environment and into our personal lives. And I found that by doing that, it really builds meaningful relationships with those individuals because they feel like you're taking the time to care about them and their success and growth. But then it also does significantly impact their ability and their performance within the job. And it comes back to, when people have a good manager or a good leader, they tend to give more for the company in spite of, maybe they're not happy with how much their health insurance costs, or maybe they don't like that they have to work every other Saturday or something. But when they have a good leader who they feel like cares about them and is helping mentor them, they're willing to put up with more of those sort of annoyances than they otherwise would have.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's great. I love the approach of kind of doing like independent book studies and, just kind of walking through those things, specifically if it's like a challenge that they've helped to identify as well. Could you maybe share, a time where you had to coach like your boss or your leader, your manager, in terms of like helping them grow as well?
Yeah, and that could be a challenge because there has to be some receptivity from that individual, right? So, like in order to do that, you kind of have to take your ego and hang it on the door a little bit. So I think certainly there's been times where I have learned things from people that have been my direct reports. And, I try always, if I'm in a hiring process and I'm hiring somebody for a specific role, I try not to be the smartest person in the room with my direct reports. Like if I hire you, I want you to be an expert at whatever I'm hiring you for. I want you to be better than I am at that. It's like you're sitting on an executive board. Your CEO should not be the best finance person. He should not be the best operations person. He should not be the best whatever. The CEO should hire those who are the best and surround himself with those people that make him and the organization better. I had an experience with that at the dental group that I helped run here in Pennsylvania, where our CEO was the founder of the organization and had a great vision. He was a master visionary and had an incredible heart, right? He loved the employees. He loved patients. But he didn't necessarily have a lot of operations experience, right? He definitely didn't have any finance experience. And so he recognized that and he was able to use the experience from his executives to help strengthen his own abilities, but then also lean on us and trust us in those areas where we were functioning so that we could help the organization grow. So I think as a leader, it's recognizing where your deficiencies are, surrounding yourself with individuals that'll help make up for those. But then you've got to trust them as they're making those decisions. And so if you get that dynamic, as a direct report, looking up to your superior, I think that's a good relationship to be in because you feel like your input is valuable and you're not just there doing things that you're being told, but you're actually contributing and you're improving upon whatever the process is that you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think you really hit on like a really key point of like not being the smartest person in the room. Because I think that it's so like, I always tell my team that it's like, I hire you because I want you to be smarter than me. I want you to be better than me. Like, obviously that makes all of our jobs, better and easier if we're continuing to kind of raise the bar in that way. And I think that some folks who get to a certain level, maybe have a challenge with that. Like, oh no, I've gotten to this level. I have to be the smartest person in the room. And, very toxic way of thinking. But I think that, I'm sure, it is prevalent in some ways. So appreciate you kind of highlighting just the importance and value of not, and I think that a lot of that, I guess I should go back. I think a lot of that, like comes from a place of fear, of like fearing of being inadequate, or fearing that someone's going to take their position if they're better than them, or whatever it may be. So just kind of highlighting the value that comes from just surrounding yourself with brilliant people, and kind of like raising that bar on the teams that you have.
Yeah, I think as a leader, you really have to, you should be the best leader for whatever your team is, right? Like that should be why you're there, because you're the best leader, not because you're necessarily the best doer of each individual component that makes up your team. Yeah. And that's important to recognize. And you're right, that takes security. It takes the ability to be okay with somebody being better than you at something. But if you're going to have a high performing team, like you need each individual piece to be high performing in the piece that they're responsible for.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rob, if folks in the audience today were inspired by the wisdom that you shared, would like to learn more about you, learn more about Overjet, et cetera, how can people reach out to you?
Yeah, our website is just overjet.com. You're welcome to investigate, take a look at it. I'd love to hear from you individually. My email is really easy to remember. It's just rob@overjet.com. So reach out to me. I'm happy to chat more about how I got to where I'm at, or if you need, if you're a dentist looking for feedback or mentorship, I'm always available.
Awesome. And we'll add that into our show notes as well. So Rob, just thanks so much for taking the time to be a guest on the Tips for Team Building podcast, where our mission is to inspire and propel others along in their leadership journeys. Really enjoyed the opportunity to reconnect with you, to be able to share your wisdom with our audience, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thanks for tuning in to the Tips for Team Building podcast, where we propel others along in their leadership journeys. If you enjoyed the show, would you please subscribe and leave a review wherever you listened? You can also visit www.spiritmco.com to find out more about how Spirit Consulting inspires virtuous leadership. We'll see you next time.